across the state system.
Question number 5, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Trade and states, does he stand by the answer given on his behalf yesterday regarding the process for ratifying the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that, and I quote, "The member misunderstands the process that these things go through. She suggested that Cabinet will ratify the agreement. Cabinet will not. In fact, Parliament ratifies the agreement." End quote. If so, why?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Trade, the Minister of Economic Development, who was acting for the Minister of Trade yesterday, may have been a little imprecise in his phraseology on behalf of the said Minister of Trade. As a result, the Minister of Trade has asked the Minister of Tertiary Education, Skills and Employment to act on his behalf and make the following clarification today. It was not strictly speaking correct to speak of Parliament ratifying the agreement per se. In fact, Parliament examines the treaty and then considers any subsequent legislation that may arise from a treaty, but it is the government that finally ratifies the treaty once Parliament has given its consideration on the treaty and on treaty-related legislative matters.
Supplementary.
Order.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So when he said yesterday that Parliament ratifies the treaty, not Cabinet, he was wrong, and in fact it was him who misunderstood the process, not Julianne Genter.
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Trade, it was not the Minister of Trade per se that misunderstood the Speaker. It was the Minister who was speaking on the Minister's behalf in Parliament yesterday who misunderstood the situation. And he, of course, has been told by the Minister not to speak for the Minister today and that the Minister would get another Minister to speak on his behalf.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So when Stephen Joyce told the House yesterday that it is Cabinet that does not ratify the treaty, that Parliament ratifies the treaty, when Stephen Joyce told the House that Parliament ratifies the treaty, not Cabinet, Stephen Joyce was absolutely wrong.
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker,
Order.
Speaking on behalf of the Minister of Trade, it is fair to say that Mr. Joyce has got it wrong yesterday. It's a very rare thing, but it's Christmas, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister of Trade has had a strong conversation with Minister Joyce, and Minister Joyce has undertaken to speak very nicely about the Minister of Trade of the House today.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Can the Minister of Trade confirm that he's got something else wrong and that he has caved into the United States over Pharmac, which will now see affordable medicines for New Zealanders put at risk at the hands of big US pharmaceutical companies? A sin he and his colleagues promised never to do.
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, no, on behalf of the Minister of Trade. And in fact, he was actually quoted, I think, on Radio New Zealand this morning, speaking from Singapore, saying the following: "It will not end parallel importing, it will not involve higher prices of pharmaceutical products." That was never really the issue. The issue is to try and preserve the underlying Pharmac model. There's been outstanding policy success for New Zealand under successive governments, and I am very confident that that will not be put at risk. It's slightly at odds with Mr. Peters' assertions.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston.
Well, does he stand by his comments? And I quote him: "I can give you a categorical assurance that New Zealanders will not be paying higher prices for their pharmaceuticals as a consequence of the TPP. And if New Zealanders do end up paying higher prices for their medicines, contrary to what he has just said, will he do the decent thing and resign?"
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of Mr. Grosser, I again perhaps have been loyal to him because actually Mr. Peters is right. He, of course, went on to say exactly that. I can give you a categorical assurance that New Zealanders will not be paying higher prices for their pharmaceuticals as a consequence of TPP. I don't think he can be any clearer than that.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Will the TPP prevent Pharmac from buying lower priced goods or generic drugs And will the TPP agreement make New Zealand vulnerable to being sued if it legislates in the public good in areas like environment and health if that cuts across multinational profits?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Trade, the member is getting into a whole range of things which of course are as part of the discussions that will be ongoing, although I think it's very clear from the media coverage of what is purported to be leaks from the negotiations that New Zealand has been arguing its case very strongly and has been seen as doing that by critics from all parts of the spectrum. But I could only repeat in regards to the Pharmac matters what the Minister himself said on the radio this morning, and I think that's already been read to the House.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will the Minister make a commitment in this House that New Zealand will not sign up to the investor-state disputes provisions of the TPP, which enable multinational corporations to sue the New Zealand governments in international courts if this Parliament were to pass laws that those multinationals did not like?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Trade, again I can't address those matters specifically because we frankly do not know yet which of the various chapters of the TPP where in fact they will land. What this government and this Parliament will get to see at the end of it, presuming that a TPP is successfully concluded, a whole range of things, and we'll have to consider those in the round in terms of actually whether it wants to take up and participate in that agreement. The reality is this, Mr Speaker, if we can achieve an agreement that is of high quality and suitable for New Zealanders, it would create great opportunities for growth and prosperity for the manufacturers, for example, that the member occasionally seems concerned about, and for other people across New Zealand that we can achieve with a high quality agreement.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will he commit his government to ensuring that Parliament has a binding deciding vote on whether New Zealand ratifies the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement if it is signed next year?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Trade, we covered this in the first answer to the question. The process, which was set up by the previous Labor government, is that Parliament examines the treaty and considers any subsequent legislation that may arise from a treaty, but it is the government that finally ratifies the treaty once Parliament has given its consideration on the treaty and on any treaty-related legislative matters. That's the process that the previous government set up, the process that was adopted for the China-New Zealand FTA, and it's the process that this government would anticipate taking place should a TPP be agreed.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Minister concerned that the public of New Zealand may be confused as to whether it is Parliament or Cabinet that ratifies the TPP, given that Mr Stephen Joyce is confused as to whether it is the Cabinet or Parliament that ratifies TPP, and Mr Stephen Jacoby has been all over the radio confusing people as to whether it is Parliament or Cabinet that ratifies the TPP?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Trade, I think we've uncovered a conspiracy of Stephens, misbehaving and reinforcing negative perceptions. Mr Speaker, it's very clear, and in fact the Minister of Trade and the Minister speaking on his behalf have said today, made it very clear the situation, and I could go through it again for the member if he so wishes, that Parliament examines the treaty and then Parliament considers any subsequent legislation that may arise from the treaty, but it is the government that finally ratifies the treaty once Parliament has given its consideration on the treaty and on treaty-related legislative matters. And I don't think, Mr Speaker, I could be much clearer than that.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Has the New Zealand government made any commitments in the TPP negotiations to support the establishment of investor-state disputes mechanisms in any final TPP agreement?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Trade, the member is once again trying to get the government to finalise the agreement today in the House, which of course can't be done because it has to be an agreement that's discussed between 12 separate countries. Again, when the agreement, if an agreement is completed, it will come before the Parliament and the Parliament will have the opportunity to examine it.
Point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question was about the position of the New Zealand government, and the Minister may say it's not in the public interest to answer that question, but I would like an answer as to what is the position of the government.
Well, you got an answer. The member may not be happy with it, but he was saying because negotiations haven't concluded, they can't make that commitment. Question number 6, Dr Cam Calder.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.